You don't laugh at a symbol like that, unless you have no idea what it cost. The bell above the diner door gave a soft metallic chime as the late afternoon crowd settled into its usual rhythm, coffee mugs clinking against ceramic plates, the low hum of conversation blending with the distant roar of jets cutting across the sky a few miles out from base. And in the far corner booth, beneath a flickering neon sign that buzzed like it was holding on to its last breath, an old man sat alone with a cup of black coffee gone cold, his hands steady, his posture relaxed, like he had nowhere else to be and no one left to impress. The sleeve of his worn denim jacket rolled just enough to reveal a faded tattoo on his forearm, its lines blurred by time but still unmistakably deliberate. A circular design enclosing a five-pointed star, ink that had long since lost its sharpness but not its presence. And across the room, a group of young Marines filled the air with laughter that carried just a little too loud, just a little too sharp, the kind of laughter that needed an audience. Sergeant Kyle Brooks leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged, boots stretched out, arms crossed, his voice cutting through the diner like a careless blade as his eyes locked onto the old man. "Hey, you see that?" he said, nudging the Marine beside him, tilting his chin toward the corner booth. "What is that supposed to be? Some kind of biker club stamp?" The table erupted in chuckles, the kind that fed off each other, growing louder, bolder, until it wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a performance, and Brooks stood, slow and deliberate, like he had already decided how this would go, crossing the worn checkered floor with heavy steps that echoed just enough to draw attention, a few heads turning, a waitress pausing mid-pour, the air tightening in a way no one could quite explain, and still, the old man didn't look up, not immediately. His fingers resting lightly against the ceramic mug as if feeling the last trace of warmth left inside it, as if the noise around him existed in a different world entirely. Brooks stopped at the edge of the table, casting a shadow across the booth, his smirk widening as he leaned slightly forward. "That ink," he said, pointing at the tattoo with a casual flick of his finger. "You get that out of a souvenir shop or something?" Another round of laughter rippled behind him, but it didn't land the way he expected, not fully, not clean, because there was something about the stillness of the man in front of him, something that didn't react the way people usually did. No flinch, no irritation, no need to respond, just a quiet presence that seemed to absorb the noise without acknowledging it. And for a brief second, barely noticeable, Brooks hesitated, just enough for the moment to almost pass. But pride pushed him forward, his hand drifting closer, finger extending as if to tap the faded lines, to prove the point, to get a reaction, any reaction. And that was when the old man finally moved, not fast, not aggressive, just enough to intercept, his hand closing gently but firmly around Brooks' wrist, stopping at inches from the ink, his grip steady, unshaken, his eyes lifting for the first time, pale blue, clear, and impossibly calm, locking onto Brooks with a weight that didn't need volume to be understood. And when he spoke, his voice was low, gravel-worn smooth by time, carrying just far enough to silence the table behind them without trying. "That symbol," he said, releasing the wrist just as calmly as he had taken it, "buried more men than you've ever known." The words didn't come with anger, didn't carry threat, but they landed anyway, heavy, deliberate, and for a moment the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, the hum of conversation thinning into something quieter, more cautious, as if the room itself had sensed a line had been crossed. And somewhere near the counter, a young corporal named Ethan Hayes, halfway through a sip of coffee, felt a chill he couldn't explain, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked toward the booth, not at Brooks, not at the laughter that was already trying to recover, but at the old man, at the way he sat, the way he held himself, the way the air around him felt just a little different, like something important had just been ignored. The laughter came back, but it did not land the same way this time, thinner, uncertain, like it had lost the ground beneath it, and Sergeant Kyle Brooks forced a grin as he pulled his hand back, rubbing his wrist as if brushing off something trivial. "Relax, old man," he said, louder than before, trying to pull the room back under his control. "It is just ink." But his voice carried a sharp edge now, something defensive buried under the sarcasm, and behind him, The Marines at the table exchanged glances that lasted a fraction too long, the kind that said they felt it too, but were not ready to admit it. The shift in the air, the way the moment had tilted without warning, and the old man did not answer. He simply returned his hand to the table, fingers resting lightly against the ceramic, his gaze drifting past Brooks as if the conversation had already ended, as if the outcome had never been in question, and that silence, that refusal to engage, pressed harder than any argument could have. Brooks scoffed, turning halfway back toward his table, throwing his arms out in a performative shrug. "You see that?" he called out, forcing a laugh. "Guy thinks he is some kind of ghost story." A couple of the Marines chuckled again, but it was weaker now, more out of habit than confidence. And near the counter, Corporal Ethan Hayes slowly set his cup down, the ceramic making a soft, deliberate click against the surface, his eyes never leaving the booth, because something about the way the old man had moved, the timing, the control, it did not match what Brooks was seeing, it did not match the story being told out loud. And Hayes had learned, over years of watching men who had been places no one talked about, that the quiet ones were the ones you paid attention to, the ones who did not need to raise their voice to change the temperature of a room. And he leaned slightly toward the older waitress beside him, his voice low, careful. "You know him?" he asked, and she hesitated, glancing toward the corner with a look that carried familiarity and something else, something like respect. "Comes in twice a week," she said softly. "Same booth, same order, never causes trouble." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "But the pilots, the older ones, they nod to him when they see him." Hayes felt that settle in his chest, a quiet confirmation of what his instincts had already begun to piece together. And across the room, Brooks had not let it go, pride pulling him back toward the booth, unwilling to leave the last word unclaimed. "Hey," he said, stepping closer again, his tone sharper now. "If it means so much, why does nobody recognize it?" The question hung there, loud enough for half the diner to hear, bold enough to demand an answer. But the old man did not rise to it. He simply reached for his cup, lifting it with steady hands, taking a slow sip as if measuring time differently than everyone else in the room. And when he set it back down, he spoke without looking up. Not everything was meant to be recognized. The words were quiet, but they carried, threading through the space with a weight that made even the clatter of dishes seem distant. And Hayes felt a chill run along his spine, because that was not deflection, it was certainty, the kind that came from lived experience, not imagination. And, without drawing attention, he slipped his phone from his pocket, turning slightly away from the room, his thumb moving quickly across the screen as he searched for a contact he had not used in months, a direct line to someone who would know what to do with a detail like that. Because whatever that symbol was, whatever history it carried, Hayes was suddenly very sure of one thing: it did not belong in a joke. The call connected on the second ring, a quiet click in Hayes's ear that felt louder than it should have, and he turned his back slightly more toward the counter, lowering his voice to something almost lost beneath the hum of the diner. "Sir, it is Hayes," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I need a quick verification on a unit marking." There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that meant attention had been given, not dismissed, and Hayes glanced over his shoulder, his eyes flicking back to the corner booth where the old man sat exactly as before, unmoved, untouched by the tension that now seemed to ripple outward from him like heat off asphalt. "Describe it." The voice on the line replied, calm, professional, but sharper now, and Hayes swallowed once, steadying himself. "Circular design, faded, 5-point star-centered, looks unofficial, almost hand-done." Another pause, longer this time, stretching just enough to make Hayes aware of his own breathing, of the distant clink of silverware, of Brooks still talking behind him, filling the silence with forced confidence. And then the voice came back, lower, slower. "Where did you see it?" Hayes hesitated for half a second, not because he did not know the answer, but because something about saying it out loud made it feel heavier. Local diner off base, older male, mid-80s, maybe older. He shifted his weight, his gaze tightening as Brooks leaned in again toward the booth, still pushing, still trying to win something that was already slipping away. "He said it was not meant to be recognized," Hayes added, almost without thinking. And that was when the line went completely silent, not disconnected, not dropped, just silent in a way that felt intentional. Like someone on the other end had just stood up without saying a word, and Hayes felt it immediately. The change, the shift from casual inquiry to something else entirely, something that carried weight, authority, consequence. Stay where you are. The voice finally said, quieter now, controlled in a way that meant urgency was being contained, not absent. Do not escalate the situation. Do not engage. I am notifying Captain Reeves. Hayes's grip tightened slightly around the phone. Yes, sir, he replied, ending the call as his eyes lifted again toward the booth, and across the room. Brooks had crossed the line from teasing into something more pointed. His tone edged with irritation now. You keep talking like that, he said, leaning closer. Like you expect someone to care. The old man did not react right away, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup for a brief second, as if grounding himself in the present, and then he looked up again, meeting Brooks's gaze without hostility, without challenge. Just a steady clarity that seemed to strip away everything unnecessary. Someone always does, he said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else he had said so far, because it was not a threat, it was not a warning, it was a statement of fact, and Brooks opened his mouth to respond. But the words did not come as easily this time. Something in his expression tightening, just for a moment, as if a part of him recognized that. He was no longer in control of how this was going to end, and near the counter, Hayes exhaled slowly, slipping his phone back into his pocket, the weight of what he had just set in motion settling in, because whatever that symbol meant, whatever history it carried, it had just reached someone who did not hesitate, and in a place like this, that only happened when the past was about to walk back into the room. The ceiling fan turned slowly above, its blades slicing through the heavy air with a soft rhythmic hum that seemed louder now that the room had grown quieter, and outside the front windows the late afternoon sun cast long amber streaks across the parking lot, glinting off windshields and chrome bumpers. But inside the diner time felt compressed, stretched tight between breaths, and Sergeant Kyle Brooks shifted his weight, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off a feeling he could not name, his confidence still there but no longer effortless. You talk like you are waiting for something, he said, forcing a smirk that did not quite reach his eyes, and the old man watched him for a moment, not with defiance, not with challenge, but with a kind of distant patience, as if he had seen this exact moment play out more times than anyone in the room could imagine. And when he spoke, it was quieter than before, almost reflective. Not waiting, he said, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the sunlight hit the glass just right. Just not surprised. The words settled into the space between them, simple, controlled, and Brooks let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. But there was tension in it now, a tightness that did not belong to humor, and behind him one of the younger Marines shifted in his seat, glancing toward the door for no clear reason, as if something in the atmosphere had begun to pull attention outward, away from the table, away from the conversation, and near the counter Hayes felt it too, that subtle change. The way the ordinary sounds of the diner had thinned, conversations lowering without anyone consciously deciding to do so, the waitress setting down a plate more carefully than before, the clink of utensils softer, restrained, as if the room itself was bracing for something it could not yet see. And then it came, not as a loud interruption, not as a dramatic entrance, but as a distant, unmistakable shift in the outside world. The low growl of an engine pulling into the lot with a precision that did not match the casual traffic of the area, tires rolling slowly over gravel, stopping with a final, deliberate stillness, and a few heads turned toward the window, curiosity replacing conversation. Brooks hesitated just long enough for it to register, his eyes flicking toward the front of the diner before snapping back to the old man, unwilling to lose his place. You expect someone to come through that door? He asked, his tone sharper now, almost challenging the idea itself, and the old man did not answer immediately, his hand resting on the table, fingers relaxed, as if the question did not require a response. And then he gave the smallest nod, not toward Brooks, not toward anyone in particular, just a quiet acknowledgement of something already in motion, and outside, a car. Door opened with a solid, controlled sound that carried through the glass, followed by another, and another, not rushed, not chaotic, but coordinated in a way that did not belong to coincidence. and Hayes felt his pulse slow rather than quicken, a strange calm settling in as recognition took hold, because he had heard that pattern before, that deliberate sequence of movement, that absence of hesitation. And it only ever meant one thing. And across the room Brooks took a step back without realizing it, just a fraction of distance, his attention pulled toward the entrance despite himself, while the old man remained exactly where he was, unmoved, unchanged, his gaze steady, as if the world outside and the world inside had finally aligned, and for the first time since the laughter had started, the room was not reacting to him, it was waiting with him. The door opened without force, just a clean, controlled motion that cut through the stillness like a line drawn with precision, and the small bell above it gave a single sharp chime that seemed to echo longer than it should have, every head in the diner turning almost in unison, not because anyone had told them to, but because something in the air demanded it, and the man who stepped inside did not raise his voice, did not scan the room in confusion. He simply paused for half a second just beyond the threshold, his posture straight, his presence unmistakable, Captain Daniel Reeves, his uniform crisp, his bearing calm but exact, the kind of stillness that did not come from relaxation but from control, and behind him, just outside the glass, another figure remained near the vehicle, not entering yet, waiting, watching, and that alone was enough to send a quiet ripple through the Marines at the table, because nothing about this arrival felt casual, nothing about it matched the easy rhythm of a late afternoon meal. Brooks straightened instinctively, his shoulders pulling back as training overrode uncertainty, but there was a fraction too much hesitation in the movement, a delay that had not been there minutes ago. "Sir," he said, his voice sharper now, more formal, trying to reclaim footing as Reeves's eyes moved past him without acknowledgement, scanning the room once, efficiently, until they stopped at the corner booth. And in that moment, something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough, a tightening at the edge of his jaw, a focus that sharpened, as if a memory had just aligned with reality in a way that left no room for doubt. And he began to walk, each step measured, unhurried, the sound of his boots against the tile steady and deliberate, not loud, but impossible to ignore, and Hayes felt it settle in his chest, the confirmation of everything he had sensed. Because this was not curiosity, this was recognition, and across the room Brooks stepped aside without being told, the movement automatic now, instinct replacing ego, while the other Marines fell silent completely, their earlier laughter gone without a trace, and the old man did not stand, did not turn, he remained seated, his hand still resting near the cup, his gaze steady as Reeves approached, stopping just short of the table, close enough to see clearly, close enough to confirm what he had already begun to suspect the moment he walked through the door, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with something heavier than conversation, something built on time rather than words, and then Reeves's eyes dropped, not to the man, but to the forearm resting on the table, to the faded lines of the tattoo that had sparked everything, and the moment his gaze settled on it, his entire posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way that called attention, but in a way that could not be mistaken by anyone who understood what they were seeing, his shoulders squared just slightly more, his chin lifting a fraction, his breath steadying as if aligning with something internal, something remembered, and Hayes felt his pulse slow again, because he had seen that shift before, not often, but enough to know exactly what it meant. Respect, not given lightly, not performed, but earned long before this moment. And Reeves finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying through the silence with absolute clarity. "Where did you serve?" he asked. But it was not a question searching for information. It was a question confirming what he already knew, and the old man looked up at him, his eyes meeting Reeves's without hesitation, without surprise. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the time for being unnoticed had passed, and for the first time since he entered, Reeves did something no one in that room expected. He stood just a little straighter, his hand lifting, not rushed, not exaggerated, but precise, deliberate, and he came to attention. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, not a chair, not a breath, not even the slow-turning fan above, as Captain Daniel Reeves held that position with a precision that did not belong to habit, but to meaning, his eyes fixed on the faded tattoo as if it were not just ink, but a doorway to something long buried. and the old man met his gaze without rising, without returning the gesture, not out of disrespect, but because he did not need to. The weight between them already understood, already acknowledged. And when Reeves finally spoke again, his voice had changed, lower now, stripped of rank and sharpened into something more personal. "Raven 6, he said, the words landing softly but carrying through the room like a distant echo that only a few could truly hear. And Hayes felt it immediately. The name, the way it settled, the way it did not sound like a guess or a question but a certainty pulled from memory. And across the diner Brooks froze where he stood, his earlier confidence dissolving into confusion as he looked from the captain to the old man, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he understood. "Sir?" Brooks said, quieter now, unsure, but Reeves did not acknowledge him. Not yet, his attention still locked on the man in the booth, waiting, and the old man exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of something shifting in his expression, not pride, not relief, just recognition, the kind that comes when a name you have not heard in decades is spoken exactly the way it was meant to be. "That was a long time ago," he replied, his voice steady, almost distant, and Reeves gave a small nod, the kind that carried agreement and disagreement at the same time. "Not for some of us," he said, and that was when the second presence outside finally moved, the door opening again with the same controlled motion, and the room turned once more as Colonel Marcus Hale stepped inside, his uniform bearing the quiet authority of someone who did not need to announce himself, his eyes scanning the room only once before landing exactly where they needed to be, on the booth, on the man, on the tattoo, and he did not hesitate, walking forward with a pace that was neither rushed nor casual, every step deliberate, every movement measured. And when he reached Reeves, he did not ask what was happening. He did not question the situation. He simply followed the line of sight down to the faded symbol, and for a fraction of a second, something broke through his composure, a flicker of recognition that was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but not before it changed everything. "I thought that unit was gone," Hale said quietly, not to the room, not even fully to Reeves, but to the memory itself, and the old man gave a slight shake of his head, the motion slow, controlled. "Most of it was," he said, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because now it was not uncertainty filling the space, it was understanding, and Brooks took another step back without realizing it, the distance between him and the booth growing as if instinct was pulling him away from something he could no longer define, while Hayes stood completely still, his earlier unease replaced by a clarity that settled deep, because this was no longer a situation, it was a revelation unfolding in real time. And Reeves, still standing straight, finally shifted his attention just enough to acknowledge the room around him, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Stand down," he said, not loudly, but with a tone that required no repetition, and every Marine in the diner responded instantly, posture correcting, voices gone, movement stilled, the earlier laughter erased as if it had never existed, and in the center of it all, the old man remained seated, unchanged, his hand resting near the cup, his presence steady, as if none of this had altered anything at all, because for him, it had not, it had simply caught up. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the diner like a weight that pressed into every corner, every table, every breath, and no one moved unless they had to, because now it was clear that this was no longer a moment of curiosity or confusion, it was something far more precise, something that demanded attention without asking for it. And Colonel Marcus Hale stood beside Captain Reeves, both of them facing the old man not as superiors addressing a civilian, but as men standing before something that existed beyond rank, beyond protocol, and Hale's eyes remained fixed on the faded lines of the tattoo, studying it not for what it looked like now, but for what it had once meant. "We were told there were no survivors," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that felt older than the room itself, and the old man let out a slow breath, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. "That was the idea," he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, no pride either, just a statement, clean and simple, like something that had been accepted long ago. And Reeves shifted slightly, his hands now resting at his sides, but his posture still held that same controlled alignment, the kind that did not fade once it was set, "Sir," he said, and the word was deliberate, chosen, directed not by obligation but by understanding. "We did not know you were still here." The pause hung for a fraction of a second, not because he lacked the word, but because none of them seemed to fit, and the old man gave the faintest nod, as if acknowledging the limitation itself. "That was also the idea," he said again, and somewhere behind them a chair creaked softly as one of the Marines shifted his weight, the sound small but noticeable. In the stillness, Brooks standing near the edge of the scene now, his earlier presence reduced to something uncertain, his hands no longer sure where to rest, his eyes moving between the captain, the colonel, and the man he had dismissed minutes ago, trying to understand how everything had changed so completely without any visible action. And Hayes watched him for a brief moment before returning his attention to the booth. Because this was not about Brooks anymore. It never had been. It was about what had just surfaced, what had been pulled out of the past, and placed quietly in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. And Hale finally lifted his gaze from the tattoo to the man himself, studying his face with the kind of focus reserved for things that mattered, things that carried history. "Do you remember the ridge line east of Key San?" he asked, his voice low, almost careful, and the old man's eyes shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, a memory aligning with a place, a time, a moment that had not been spoken aloud in decades. "I remember the wind," he said, and that was all, but it was enough, because Hale exhaled slowly, the answer confirming more than any detailed explanation could have, and Reeves glanced toward him briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, one that did not need words, and then Reeves turned back to the room, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying authority that cut clean through any remaining uncertainty. "Clear the area," he said, not loudly, but with finality, and the Marines moved immediately, not rushed, not chaotic, just efficient, chairs sliding back, footsteps measured, conversations gone before they could even begin, until the space around the booth opened up, leaving only the three of them at its center, and the old man watched it happen without reaction, as if it were all expected, as if it had already happened somewhere else, sometime long before. And when the room had finally settled again, quieter than it had ever been, Hale spoke once more, his voice lower now, almost reflective. "We spent years trying to piece together what happened out there," he said, and the old man's gaze returned to the cup in front of him, his fingers resting lightly against the rim. "Some things were not meant to be pieced together," he replied, and the way he said it left no room for argument, no space for curiosity to push further, because whatever answers existed, they were not coming from him, not today, and not here. No one spoke for several seconds after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything spoken too quickly would have broken the balance that had settled over the room, and Captain Reeves shifted his stance just slightly, not out of discomfort, but to align himself more squarely with the man in the booth, his voice lowering further, no longer carrying command, only respect. "We have records," he said carefully, "fragments, partial debriefs, missing personnel lists that never fully closed." His eyes flicked once more to the tattoo, but nothing complete, and the old man gave a faint exhale through his nose, not dismissive, not approving, just acknowledging the truth of it. "There would not be," he said, his tone even, as if explaining something simple. "It was never meant to be written down." And Colonel Hale nodded slowly, the kind of nod that comes when a suspicion becomes confirmation, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window, as if measuring the distance between then and now. "5 operators," he said quietly, almost to himself. "No official designation, no insignia, no record of deployment." His eyes returned to the booth, sharper now, and one symbol passed between them, and the old man's fingers moved slightly, brushing against the faded ink on his forearm, not to display it, not to protect it, just a small, unconscious contact, like touching a memory that still had weight. "It was not a symbol," he said. "It was a promise." The words landed softly, but they carried a gravity that made even Hale pause for a fraction of a second, and Reeves's jaw tightened subtly, as if he understood more than he was willing to say out loud. "We lost contact after that ridge," Reeves added, his voice steady but quieter now. "Command assumed the worst," and the old man looked at him, not with accusation, not with disappointment, just with a calm that seemed to accept the logic of it. "Command always does," he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact. And behind them, near the edge of the cleared space, Brooks stood completely still, his earlier bravado gone entirely, replaced by something closer to realization, his eyes fixed on the man he had mocked, replaying every word, every gesture, every moment that now felt different under this new light. And Hayes remained where he was, silent, attentive, knowing better than to interrupt what was unfolding. Because this was not information being exchanged, it was history surfacing, piece by piece, in a place that had no right to hold it. And Hale stepped forward just enough to close the distance by a single pace. Not intrusive, not aggressive, but deliberate. "Why stay silent?" he asked, his voice measured, not demanding an answer, but seeking understanding. And the old man's gaze shifted once more toward the window, toward the fading sunlight stretching across the lot, his reflection faint in the glass, older now, lined by time, but unchanged in the ways that mattered. "Because the ones who needed to remember already do," he said. And then, after a brief pause that seemed to carry decades within it, he added, "And the rest were never meant to." The words settled into the room like dust after something long buried had been disturbed, and no one challenged them. No one questioned them. Because something about the way they were said made it clear that there was nothing left to uncover here, nothing that could be taken and turned into something clean or complete. And Reeves finally inclined his head, just slightly, a gesture that carried more meaning than any formal salute could have in that moment. "Understood," he said, and for the first time since he had entered, his voice held something softer, something human, and the old man gave a small nod in return, not as acknowledgement of rank, but as recognition of understanding. And in that quiet exchange, the weight of the entire encounter settled into something final, something resolved without ever being fully explained. The tension did not release all at once. It eased, slowly, like a held breath finally allowed to pass, and the diner began to find its rhythm again, not the same as before, not as loud, not as careless, but quieter, more deliberate, as if something unseen had reminded everyone in the room that not all stories were meant to be spoken lightly. And Captain Reeves stepped back half a pace, not turning away, not breaking the moment too quickly, his eyes still on the man in the booth, committing the image to memory in a way that felt intentional. While Colonel Hale gave one final look at the faded tattoo, not studying it now, but acknowledging it, the way one acknowledges a marker left behind by something that mattered, and without another word, both men straightened in unison, their movements precise, their posture aligned, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to follow their lead without instruction, back straightening, conversations halting, even the staff behind the counter pausing mid-motion. Because respect, when it is real, does not need to be explained, it spreads, and Reeves lifted his hand once more, not sharply, not for display, but with a controlled motion that carried weight far beyond the gesture itself, and Hale mirrored it, the two of them standing in silent acknowledgement before the man who remained seated, unchanged, his hand resting near the empty cup, his expression calm, as if this was not a moment of recognition, but simply the natural order correcting itself. And, after a second, Reeves lowered his hand, giving a slight nod, not formal, not rigid, but personal. "Take care, sir," he said quietly, and the old man returned the nod just as simply. No words, no need for them. And that was enough, because everything that mattered had already been said without being spoken, and the two officers turned, their departure as controlled as their arrival, walking toward the door with the same measured steps, the same absence of hesitation, the outside light catching them briefly before they stepped through and disappeared into the late afternoon, the low sound of engines returning, fading into the distance, and inside, the room exhaled, not loudly, not all at once, but gradually, life returning in small, careful movements, a chair pulled back, a quiet conversation resumed, a coffee pot lifted, and near the edge of the cleared space, Sergeant Kyle Brooks stood alone for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the booth, his earlier certainty gone completely, replaced by something heavier, something that would stay with him long after this day ended. And he took a slow step forward, then another, stopping just short of the table, his voice lower now, stripped of everything that had been there before. "Sir," he said, the word careful, deliberate. "I did not know." And the old man looked up at him, not judging, not dismissing, just steady, the same calm that had been there. "From the beginning, you were not supposed to," he replied, and there was no edge to it, no lesson forced into the words, just truth, simple and complete. And Brooks nodded once, swallowing whatever else he might have said, stepping back with a respect that came too late to prevent the mistake, but not too late to understand it. And Hayes watched from the counter, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned away, letting the scene settle into memory, because moments like this did not happen often, and when they did not need to be recorded to matter. And in the corner booth, the old man reached for his wallet, placing a few bills on the table with the same steady hand, rising slowly, not because he was weak, but because he did not rush anything, not anymore. And he adjusted his jacket, the sleeve falling just enough to cover the tattoo once more, the symbol disappearing from view as if it had never been there at all. And without looking back, he walked toward the door, the bell chiming softly as he stepped out into the fading light, leaving behind nothing but a quiet understanding that settled over the room like a final echo, because some things were never meant to be seen twice, and some names were never meant to be spoken again.